John Simmons. I'm a professor of philosophy. I'm a courtesy professor of computer science, and I'm directing the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics here at the University of Kansas. Our interdisciplinary connections and contacts and conversations really make this research possible. So the topics that we're interested in have to do with the intersection between technology and society, and how, for example, changing platforms, changing technologies, emerging tech more broadly, has social impacts that we can study and maybe to some extent anticipate. We want to understand how design choices in technology have impacts that are either harmful or beneficial to the aspects of society that we care about, our relationships, our institutions, and so on. And we want to create the conditions where we can thoughtfully and deliberately reflect on our design choices and how their social impacts will manifest. And so, our hope is to create a platform for understanding the way that technology changes us and changes our social relations, but also developing a space where we can be reflective and deliberate and create conditions for flourishing and resilient communities. Social norms do seem to be changing extremely rapidly. We have lots of salutary or healthy social norms that support our well-being and thriving institutions, and often support our critical social institutions that make national security and our national well-being possible. We see that those norms are under pressure, and it's difficult to understand often why norms are changing so quickly and why or how technology might play into that. So we do see a strong correlation between the rapid change in social norms and the emergence of, for example, the social media platforms, mobile telephony, and so on. And part of our work involves trying to understand how, for example, the shifting platforms create alternative new spaces for different kinds of social equilibria to develop. We see, for example, in our romantic lives, the dating apps have fundamentally changed social equilibria around how we initiate relationships, how we treat one another, etc. Very few people like the dating apps, and yet it seems that to have a dating life in our time, you do kind of have to be part of it. It's a set of norms that's emerged, in part in response to the nature of that platform, these platforms, and it often is precisely the design of the platforms that shapes the emerging social norms that have organized our current dating lives. So that's a very concrete case where the design choices in the platforms kind of shape the way our social lives take the form that they do. But there are also occasions where technology facilitates the intervention of our adversaries in the social norms of Western liberal democracies. We see instances of this, especially in Russian actions against, for example, the Romanian elections, that are facilitated by not only social media platforms, but also the clever deployment of AI in various ways. There's lots to be studied, there's lots we don't understand, but it's certainly clear that social norms are changing at an extraordinarily rapid pace, that pace is, at least to some extent, facilitated by these emerging technologies, and this is a topic of deep interest if we want to preserve the integrity of critical social institutions. We are the locus for interdisciplinary conversations at University of Kansas around emerging technologies, and our role has really been to bring the expertise of philosophers, historians, psychologists into contact with the actual development of technologies and the deliberations about how to design platforms of various kinds. So our goal here, and I think we've had some success, is to allow technologists access to questions about what we care about, what we should care about, what the history of our practices has been. These aren't solely technical questions, right? So it is true that philosophers in particular have brought attention to questions in machine learning around bias and fairness and privacy, and have done extraordinary work over the past 10, 15 years. And that work has influenced the development of these technologies. So debates around AI alignment, for example, have been informed by philosophical practice, by the work of ethicists. And those have often led to technical solutions. But the way we think about questions of value, what we care about, and so on, that's not been accessible to technologists and engineers. And we hope we can model, going forward, a new way of doing research that takes values seriously from the ground floor up. If we're going to think about a concept like cybersecurity, we're going to be thinking essentially about what we care to protect. What is it that we care about? What aspects of that function do we prioritize as being the most important functional features of a system, and what do we want to defend and protect? Resilience involves the capacity to respond to perturbations of various kinds or attacks of various kinds in a way that this allows a system to bounce back to where it should be, what it should be doing. It's not what it is doing, but what it ought to be doing. That's the kind of thing we have to determine before we can understand how to make a system resilient. We have to understand its identity. And that requires a kind of political and moral deliberation that doesn't come naturally to technologists. We're in a space now, in a political moment, where we're beginning to realize that we do have the power to change what we thought we had to take for granted, what we thought we had to accept. And so I'm really heartened by the way that state-level action has engaged with tech companies to promote the values of the people in those states. We see states like Utah, states like Kansas, even California, taking legislative action that reflects the values of that state. We recently in Kansas insisted on age verification for porn sites like Pornhub, for example, last year. And of course, it doesn't mean that you can't access those sites, but it does mean that we've kind of asserted, our values with respect to what we care about as Kansans. It's really important for us to remember that we can do that. We have the right to push back in various ways against the tech companies and not to accept necessarily their vision of the good life. Our state is characterized by a way of living and a conception of the good life that's probably not shared by the leaders of the tech industry in California. We're finding our capacity to do those things, to regulate tech in ways that reflect our values without necessarily stifling innovation. The work of the center is intended to kind of illuminate the interaction between technology and society without necessarily determining how we respond to that. I think the way we as a state respond to this will require us to have a political deliberation, a moral and political deliberation about, how we understand the good life, how we understand what matters, how we understand what we need to protect. No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, it's heartening that the people of the state of Kansas have decided that regulating the tech companies in a way that reflects our values is a good thing to do. And of course, that's going to vary from state to state. As we move forward, we'll see increasingly that schools will ban cell phones during the school day, because we can obviously understand why that's been harmful to our children and harmful to the development of young people. I think we can very easily enforce age restrictions in platforms where we don't want our children to be active. But moreover, or more generally, we can kind of endorse the kind of good life we would hope for, not just for children, but for adults, for our communities, etc. That, of course, is a political and moral decision that hopefully our work will at least facilitate. So we're at present developing a project on the resilience of software development and the software supply chain. We've recognized that there's a strong social component to that. We saw, for example, in the recent exautils attack, our Chinese adversaries were able to use very sophisticated social engineering tactics to exploit weaknesses in the development of Linux. That was a potentially devastating attack that relied on a deep understanding of the social vulnerabilities of the open source community. The combination of expertise that we have at KU, the combination of the insight into the social dimension, the social attack surface, and the capacity to develop technical solutions or formal solutions or form new techniques for offsetting those attacks, I think that's our unique strength. So a key focus of our work. So we've been talking a lot in recent years about norms and social institutions. What we're doing now is bringing that more theoretical or more philosophical work into contact with the sort of the concrete technical details of software engineering in ways that will allow us to develop more resilient software engineering practices going forward. And that's our hope, and that's one of our big projects over the next few years.